I think the first pilot really proved to be our learning curve on multiple things in terms of processes, in terms of measurement, and in terms of really just engaging with the community and knowing how to interact with them.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Mission Driven Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with mission-driven entrepreneurs, investors, academics, and the wider ecosystem about the platform of entrepreneurship to solve the big challenge that we're facing in our environment, communities, and economies. Through this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by Pankhuri Shah, who is the founder of Project Deep. It's an organization that believes that the unconditional lump sum of money empowers people, unleashes their aspirations, and gives them a choice in charting their own pathway out of poverty. For a number of years now, we've been talking about the role of UBI as a way to alleviate the challenges around poverty, be it at that moment or something even more chronic. She's developed a really interesting model for how she's developing it in a way that is already in the global south, and it's something that is very new to India. And I think it's just a fantastic story about an entrepreneur who's seen a challenge, wants to try and do something about it, and is building a platform and going forward. So with that, Pankhuri, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's really great to have you with us.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the opportunity. And like you said, there's so much conversation and debate about this topic that it's great to have a platform like this to really build more visibility, to really share our message with a larger audience. So thank you very much for having me.
As a starting point, what's your personal background and what is the mission that you're on there at Project Deep?
So my name is Pankhuri. I'm based out of Mumbai, which is in India. Spent a large part of my career in the corporate space, actually, almost 8 years working in different spaces, the stock market, working in financial and management advisory. And those were great, great intellectually stimulating jobs to have. And I learned a lot of what I know today from there. But I was looking for something more to do with my time. I was looking in what are the ways to give back to society, and which is when I actually moved to the development sector. I worked at an organization called Dasra, which was a great launchpad for me into the space. It's through this time of working with different organizations in different locations and sectors that I really understood how complex and intricate these challenges are. And that's when COVID hit, right? COVID really brought the harsh realities much more in the face for us. Two things happened. One is that we saw how vulnerable communities are, right? One shock was enough to really push them back multiple steps. And the second is the advent of cash transfers, because when it was difficult to put any to reach communities with any other kind of aid or in-kind assistance, cash transfers was something that was possible, and we saw that across the world. So I think these two things happened, and for me personally, there was a seed that was sown long ago, watching the talks of Rutger Bregman, where he speaks about how poverty is a lack of cash and not a lack of character. It has really stayed with me. The work of Give Directly past decade, where they have been able to prove that it's a very simple and effective program, and we don't really need to spend huge amounts of philanthropic and welfare capital into complex administrative processes or complex designing. Instead, all of that money can actually be used to give it directly to the community. And I do firmly believe that they are very well placed to use it in a way that will best improve their lives, right?
Before you got into this, and when you made the decision to jump out of, not just corporate into nonprofit, but nonprofit into entrepreneurship, what catalyzed you to take that step? Like, why not continue working within the nonprofit space and find a new one, or, align to a government program, or go back to corporate and find a way to do a CSR project that had the same goals? Like, why entrepreneurship, and what was the catalyst that made you say, okay, now's the time?
I got promoted at my previous job, and I was looking for where can I give my money, and was thinking what's the best use of my money. And I thought that's direct cash transfers. And to my surprise, no one in India was doing such programs. And so the idea of aligning to another organization died right there, because there was no one else. And so to make this idea happen, really the only way to do it was to do it ourselves.
So, okay, the organization's thesis centers around the idea that the power of unconditional lump sum money is good to empower people. How did you come to this belief? Did you have some research? Did you have some resources that you looked at and said, okay, this is how we need to look at our thesis?
I think it's a combination of the two. I think I'll speak about both. I think the personal belief is that there's a very strong power dynamic between a giver and a receiver, right? The giver tends to take more of the role of the decider, like it's my money or it's my program, and I decide what happens and what development should look like for you. I'm not saying that's badly intentioned, but I'm saying that sometimes misses the nuances simply because our realities are very different. Even if I lived for 6 months in a village, I know I'm coming back home, right? So that my experience is not fully complete. And therefore, I'm not able to fully kind of imagine what their stressors, priorities, challenges could be. Cash comes the closest to being able to eliminate that, right? Remove the projection bias, remove the hierarchy, and bring the communities that we seek to serve on an equal footing. So that's the personal kind of ethos and essence, right? Breaking discrimination, breaking hierarchies, and really empowering people. But research on cash transfers is, I mean, you'll hear that it's out there that cash transfers is the second most research program, right? Like deworming is the first, cash transfers has the most RCTs after that, and yet it's not picked up in India. So that was a big gap. Not just Give Directly, but in India as well. Back in 2011, we had a program with 12,000 people on UBI, which was extremely successful. And so that seemed like a good enough reason to go in, right? And then you have to get your hands dirty. It can't be theoretical anymore.
You said it was a success. Why didn't it continue? And given the fact that it had shut down, why did you think that you could do it better or differently than in that case?
I don't think the idea was better or differently. I think the idea was to pick it up again, right? I think it had started off as a research project, and research project, unlike NGOs, do have an end line. You do the project, you end, and then you kind of try to make it into something. And unfortunately or fortunately, the political situation in India did not allow it to grow from there. So I think it was not about doing it better. It was to say we have this body of work. How do we build on it? How do we revive that entire movement that had started back then?
Okay, so you have this idea, you have this thesis, you have your belief. How did you approach designing your pilot project to prove the thesis, to prove that your belief wasn't insane? Like, what were some things that you were focused on? Were there key principles you wanted to follow, key considerations to its structure? Like, how did you approach, your first pilot, identifying people and proving your thesis?
So the idea is that cash transfers largely can be transferred in two ways, right? One is monthly smaller amounts that go on for a longer duration, and one is a lump sum amount given at one time. And that was our first choice. So there has been a body of work on lump sum transfers as well, which speaks about the potential of asset creation, because if you're getting 70, 80, 90% of your annual income in one go, you're obviously going to be able to make very good use of it in terms of improving your life significantly. So that was the first choice. We were very fortunate to be advised by Miriam Laker, who's the research director at Give Directly, who kind of walked us through the thought process of how to make this choice. And that's how we arrived on lump sum. We traveled extensively. We visited more than 50 villages to understand what are people's aspirations. Like, if they did win a lottery, what would they do? That gave us a lot of motivation. That gave us a lot of hope, because people had ideas. They were very ambitious. And you could see that this little push in that sense would really dramatically change their lives. But it also brought out nuances, that debt cycles in some places pick up just before monsoon, because people need money to buy raw materials, people need money to pay labor. So that's when we thought of the timing aspect, that while it's still unconditional, we're not saying you have to use it for agriculture, but if we do give it before you're going to go to take debt, it'll break that cycle, at least for those who are going to take debt. The program is also universal. So within a hamlet, we're not choosing people. That comes from the belief of also that people know best. Like, what line will we draw? We'll say that, okay, if you earn more than 50,000, you won't get it. But that's an artificial line, right? You could be earning more than 50,000 and have other challenges. We also transfer the money to a woman's bank account. Research on this is mixed. There are some research that says that when you're considering the family as a unit, the outcomes are likely to remain the same. If my roof is leaking, the husband and the wife are hardly going to fight about whether to fix the roof. So, but yet in India, there's a lot of patriarchy. Like, women may not have bank accounts, they may not have the same financial decision making. This is to have one step forward, right? Like, if the money is in your account, somebody will have to ask you to withdraw it. Somebody will have to ask you or tell you what they're doing with it. So it's to say, how do we do our bit and at least pushing the conversation a little bit forward? So I think those are the main design principles, and we didn't start out with them. We kind of built it through our conversations with people and through our visits. I think before we did our first program, we did a lot of visits to be able to understand even where we should start and how we should do it. So I think that's how this the flagship program was designed for us.
And how big was the flagship? I mean, you go into a village, you could have hundreds of families. How can you support the whole village, or did you have to have some line somewhere in there? Like, how did you approach that? And then how many families were involved in, say, the first pilot?
In India, the way it's divided is that the villages also have, they're also divided into hamlets. So you would have multiple hamlets that make up a village. It's difficult to find smaller hamlets, but that kind of made the funnel easier for us. We said that, okay, let's just look at hamlets that have about 40 to 60 households. So that, because for the first one, fundraising was the biggest constraint. And it still continues to be, but that's the constraint, right? How do you sell a new idea? How do you raise that much money? Within that, we also wanted to look at two things. One was just access to market. There are so many villages in India that are also cut off, which means that the cost of being able to do something, the transport and other costs would be higher than actually doing something, which is not the most efficient use of resources. Still helpful, but maybe not the most efficient. So for our first one, just to be able to learn and understand, we said, let's look where there is a close by market. People have adequate ambition, aspiration, skill set to be able to really make this work. And all of this was determined through conversation. At that point, we didn't have like a tool that we were filling out. It was, speaking to people, visiting the place. And we said tribal, right? So the tribal, because tribal communities also typically have more of a social homogeneity because the similar groups live together. So you won't see a caste dynamic playing out there. I think these were the few, we were feeling our way out. So these were the few things we understood and said, okay, let's go with this. I think those were the few conditions for the first one. Yeah. So that was 50 households.
When it came to the pilot itself, how much money was given to each household, and was there a duration, say like 3 months, 6 months, a year, that you're going back and kind of measuring success and having conversations that allowed you to understand how you could improve the next round?
Going in, we didn't have any big sense of what success. I'll be very honest, we didn't. But we went in with a baseline survey. We said that whatever the outcome, we should be able to measure it to the pre-program status. So our baseline was very extensive because we said money can impact many different parameters. So we looked at assets, we looked at finances, debt, we looked at health, nutrition, all of it, right? It's a very extensive survey. For us, again, the marker for understanding where people have used the money came from two things. One was that because it's a lump sum, it would be used pretty immediately. It doesn't get staggered. Like you won't break up the amount to use it. If you've used it, you've used the full thing. And that typically happens in the first 3 to 4 months. It was not mandated by us, but that's the way it happens. If you've got money, if it's lying in the bank account, it'll get consumed in routine. But if you want to do like a big asset purchase, you do it immediately. It was also the timing for us to say then we can fundraise for the next one when we have more solid evidence. At that time, we didn't have the metrics to say what are we measuring. It's when we went back there and we realized that okay, there's been a dramatic increase in people have used it in the, and I'll speak to this a little later, but it was a fascinating experience to go back. That's when we then came down to say okay, these are the potential metrics that get impacted immediately, and then there are long-term metrics that we can measure. So I think the first pilot really proved to be our learning curve on multiple things in terms of processes, in terms of measurement, and in terms of really just engaging with the community and knowing how to interact with them. So
What would you say were the biggest takeaways from that time? Like, what were the things that you learned, or that was like, wow, we didn't think about that before? Were there a couple of those things that you like saw, not just once or twice, but you saw, pretty regularly, like when the money was going out or what they were spending on was like, wow, this is something that I'm really glad that we spent the time to understand this better, and that will help us for the next round.
I think we underestimated what it takes to open a bank account. Like in our realities, a bank account takes 2 days to open. When we went there, it took us about 3 or 4 days to figure out what it takes to make a bank account active. And then it took us actually like 2 weeks of going to one spot, going to another, which meant like first getting the right documentation, having a cell phone to be able to link to it, going to the bank. So it was a long process which we did not know at that time. So I think by the time we finished this, we knew all the permutation combination, that if this doesn't work, you do this, if that. So that was one big learning. The second was some of the impact on the intangibles, right? I think one of the biggest takeaway for us was that aspirations get unleashed. When we gave the money, we saw a daily wage laborer becoming self-employed for the first time. That person did not look us eye to eye before. Like he would look down and talk, respond to what we were asking. With the program, you're seeing him relaxing with his hands on his head. His entire body language has changed, and he's telling us, you've supported me, I'm going to double this amount and really make it work for me, right? This is his commitment to us. And when we went back in a year, he had actually done that. We also saw creative usages. We saw a ninth standard boy saying that, during our functions, we don't have music. and there is no speaker set available, get a speaker set for commercial use. We would have never thought of these things. And the biggest one was on dignity. I think the one that we went back, first thing we heard the women telling us is that we could go to purchase things with our head held high, because no longer did we have to ask for goods on credit and not having to take debt. That was such a relief for people, because it did not just mean that they could expand their activities, it meant that they could do the activities on time. So they were showing off their crops like proud parents, like, look how big my crop has grown, it's never been so green, it's looking so good. So those were the things that were unanticipated. Those were things we learned, that when we have doubts about whether this amount is enough or not, are we doing the right thing or not, hearing this is very reinforcing, to say that this support actually means a lot more in their hands than the way we look at it.
What's the business model for this? Like, I expect the first 50, you could have convinced individuals to give, you could have done a crowdsourcing, you could have worked with CSR to do a distribution, but now you're talking about you're growing, you need a business model. So how many families are now involved, and what's the business model that will support your growth or that supports the current operations?
You're right. The first one was pretty much crowdsourcing, where we went from family to family saying, support one family, right? I think I missed saying this before. It's 65,000 rupees, which is $750 per family. And that remains standard across all our programs. We started with 50. We've now reached 264 families in 7 different hamlets. And next week itself, we'll be launching our next program, which will be with another 250 families. So we will end our 2 years with 500 families. And we're very excited about that. We think it's a really good number to be at. To your question on the business model, right? I think what our own work has allowed us to do is build evidence. It's established us as players, but also build the evidence on cash transfer. So we saw 47 additional acres of land being tilled, which is a 50% increase in a community of 50 households. It means 22% increase in income. It means employment for more than 30 people. It means that the money that they earned from the harvest can be reinvested. So 68% of the families have reinvested the same money into other avenues of livelihood, or of just building security. Like 50% families have improved their homes. We're able to talk about all of these with much more confidence, which means that our pool of funders has expanded from individuals to include companies, to include bigger philanthropists. Being the front runner has that advantage of us being able to pursue both these routes very deeply. And so we're a 6-member team. We're likely to expand going forward and look at where the traction on both of these is taking us.
Beyond the cash payments, though, what are some things around the cash itself that help support better outcomes? And have you really looked at, like, this village has already 1, 2, 3 programs. If we had cash, much better outcome, versus if we just go to a hamlet only with cash and there's nothing happening, that it goes down. Like, what are some other things around that payment, or around that thesis that allow for a better potential outcome?
The communities that I'm speaking about, right? The only hurdle is really cash. The markets are there, the idea is there, the resources, the opportunities, it's all just there. It's all like lying underutilized, and money is able to sort of help them optimize it. Having said that, what really works is also bringing in organizations that improve the access to government schemes. So if that happens, then you're basically catalyzing that entire money, to say that if government is giving you money for this, you use the cash transfer for something else. In our second location, we also have a partner that works on financial literacy, in the sense of insurance. So if you have a steady stream of money, can you take insurance? Can you understand what insurance is and actually claim it when the time is right? Because people take insurance, they don't know what to do with it. So I think some of these boundaries, these basic necessity kind of programs work. And then there's a third bucket which we've been exploring, not really worked specifically in that space, but spaces where cash transfers will not work immediately. So there's no water access, there's no road access. So I think that's a stack that we have to build. Can we bring in an ecology partner who will first make a well or a pond to alleviate the most immediate stressor? Because if I give you money and you don't have water, it doesn't match. So I think that's the space where a community program is important, that the money addresses individual stressors, what does the community need? And that comes in with a partner. Like Deep cannot be doing all of it, but we have the advantage of having lots of partners in this space. Where can we bring them in to plug it in? So I think there are many ways to do it. It really depends on what outcomes we're looking for. But in certain communities, just money works.
Do a lot of these families require a second payment, say in a year, or are you saying, look, it's one and that's all you get? Like, how do you ensure that these families don't become dependent upon this as like an annual income or a semi-annual income?
Honestly, the program is currently defined as a one time payment. And again, that's based on the research that we've seen so far, the evidence that we've seen. Having said that, like I said, it's a learning journey. We watch all the communities for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. At any point, if we do feel that, okay, this might need a relook, we come to that. But I feel like that's 3 to 5 years away.
Reflecting on your journey over the last 2 years, if you're kind of like to think back about what you've seen, what you've accomplished, and then what your future holds.
I think the most, like I was saying before, the first project is the closest to my heart. And going back there in 3 months and in 1 year have been the significant milestones for us to be able to see visibly how the community has transformed, how the people have transformed in terms of self confidence, their ability to engage, without having so much stress, which you could see on their faces before, which doesn't now appear that much. So to be able to know that this is possible and this can be done was a great moment. When I think about the fact that in Rajasthan, in our second project, for example, 70% of the funds were used for creating assets. And when you think about it, that okay, this person has moved from a mud house to a proper house, and that their children are not going to worry about housing anymore. I think those are the things that keep us going. That
So then, what's the role of passion as a fuel source for your mission? Is it what gets you through the difficult moments? Is it something you have to tap into frequently, or is it just something that's been growing along with you?
I think it's been growing along with me, right? And I can say that for Mazamil as well. For the two of us, that's the driver, to be able to say that if you really, really believe in it and if you're passionate about it, that's what will keep you going, because everything else ebbs and flows. Everything else has a lot of doubts and questions and a lot of firefighting figuring out to do. Passion is what remains constant. The minute you stop believing that this works is when things start getting even more difficult. The fact that you know it works and you have the ability to make it big is what at least keeps me going.
All right. As a last question, the next generation, what are 2 or 3 pieces of advice you'd give them to get them a little bit further along in their own journey?
I think the first advice I would give is just start. Often we get mired in this, like, let me figure it out, let me plan it, let me get it right, and then I'll do it. I don't think there's any such thing. I think the first thing is getting your hands dirty. No matter what you want to do, getting your hands dirty is the best way to get going. The second is to, what you said, that knowing that you're not alone, like asking for help, extremely essential, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed. An entrepreneur's journey, no books, no advice can prepare you for it, because things come at you from all directions, but you're not alone. I think just knowing that, even if you have one or two people to reach out to, you must. And the third thing is, I think, to keep going, because I think the first few years are the difficult ones. Once you find stability, once you find certain rhythm, things start getting easier. So, not giving up at the first sign of challenge. I'm not saying it's easy, but it gets easier. I know that I'm in a better place than I was last year. So I think those are a few of the things that I've found useful in my journey.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your journey with us. This has been fantastic.